Sure. Okay, so thank you so much for being on today's contract class. It's 3 o'clock. This is Simon Casades. We're going to dive deep into paragraph 14C, which talks about, the seller's right to cancel. Seller's right to cancel. So the reason I wanted to specify on this on this provision is because a lot of agents are under the misconception of what the proper way to cancel once a buyer breaches the contract, right? You're the listing agent and you're going through the trenches and the buyer does not perform. What is the procedure? What is the protocol? And how do you maneuver through the process? So this is where it really gets interesting, because it gives you all of the answers to your question when it comes to paragraph 14C-E as in Edward as well. So on the RPA, it has the breakdown of one like 14A, which is the time period of removal of contingency and cancellation of rights. And then 14B as in boy talks about the buyer review of documents and the request of repairs. And then section 14C is the section that ultimately provides the avenue of where the seller has the right to cancel escrow. Okay, so let's dive deep. Have any questions regarding this provision? Please make sure to just say, "Hey, Simon, I have a question." So under 14B, under 14C, it says that if by the end of the time period, the buyer does not do anything, either remove a contingency or cancel, the seller can give the buyer one last chance to decide. If the buyer still will not commit one way or the other in writing, the seller has the right to cancel the transaction. There are many activities that buyer needs to comply with during the contract period, other than those concerning the contingencies. This includes making a deposit with escrow, signing and returning the seller disclosures, giving title company information if needs, and providing verification of cash or down payment. If buyer fails to do any of these requirements, then the seller can cancel, but only after first giving the buyer one last chance to perform as promised on the RPA. The seller must give the buyer at least a 2-day notice buyer to perform to attempt before a cancellation is done. Okay, so let's go into this and really just go through the breakdown and dissect this, because again, I'm just giving you an illustration on how a seller has the right when it comes to a cancellation. And I just want to be very open and transparent on this, because again, all of you are listing agents. All of you represent the seller, and the buyer is dragging their feet and not performing within the time of the necessary of the contract. Then the seller has the right to say, look, let's go ahead and push the buyer and the agent to perform. And that's where the notice comes into play. Okay, and you have to at least minimum give 2 days, or if you come to some other type of agreement, it can be 1 day or more days on the notice to perform, but it's already default to 2 days. Okay, so seller section C, number 1 says seller right to cancel buyer's contingency. So if by the time specified in this agreement, buyer does not deliver to seller removal of a contingency or cancellation of this agreement, the seller, after first delivering a buyer a notice to perform, better known as the BNBP, may cancel this agreement. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit, except for any fees incurred by the buyer. Okay, so what does that entail? What does that mean? So you're in the trenches. Congratulations. You just opened escrow. And the first thing that the contract says that the buyer has 3 business days to put the deposit in escrow, right? And 3 days come and there is still no deposit in escrow. Then what does the seller needs to do in order for this to be in effect? Well, the seller has to give the notice to perform to the buyer. You cannot unilaterally just cancel because the 3 days came, 3 days have passed, and the buyer has never put the money into escrow, right? It's not automatic. That's correct. So what you need to be doing is being connections with the escrow company. Escrow should be your eyes and ears when something is not going in the direction, right? It's very clear, and it's in the RPA that there's certain things that the buyer must do in order for us to continue the process. It's no difference than the seller has certain things they need to do in order to continue the process. And if someone breaches the contract, then ultimately the next step is to send out the notice to perform. And the notice to perform allows the buyer time to do what they need to do to exercise the right to stay in escrow, because if the seller sends the notice to perform and the buyer does not perform with the time specified, the seller has the right to cancel. And I've seen circumstances and I've seen situations where the listing agent and the seller do not understand the practice and the probable cause and how all this works. And they just say, I'm going to cancel on you. Well, you cannot, if you're a savvy buyer's agent, you cannot just cancel because the buyer didn't put the money in escrow. There's paperwork, documentations, and a paper trail that must be followed in order to effectively articulate your position as the agent involved in the transaction. Section 2 talks about seller's right to cancel buyer's contract of obligation. Says seller, after first delivering to buyer the notice to buyer to perform, right? This is the buyer to perform. May cancel this agreement if by the time specified in this agreement, buyer does not take the following actions. 1, deposit funds as required by paragraph 3D1 or 3D2, or if the funds deposit pursuing to paragraph 3D1 or 3D2 are not good when deposited. So even if the buyer intended to put the money as a cashier's check or a check in general, something happens or there's not a sufficient amount of money as agreed upon, right? Let's just say, for example, it's $1 million offer. The seller and the buyer agree to that $1 million offer, and the seller accepts. But the listing agent and the seller say it's contingent upon that the buyer puts in 3% of the initial deposit, but the buyer only puts in 2% of the initial deposit. Does that mean that we can continue with the process because in good faith the buyer did put some money in escrow? Or is that an avenue that we can exercise the right to send the notice to perform for the difference of that 1% into escrow? And if the buyer doesn't perform, we have the right to cancel. I mean, what's your take on this? What do you think is the appropriate? Buyer put in 2%. The seller said, we'll accept your offer, but it's in lieu of 3%. Who is right and who is wrong in this case? Someone is giggling, but who thinks it's the right, or it doesn't really matter? There's some money in escrow, so we have.
I'll chime in.
Yeah, Steve, please do so.
That deposit money actually is not a contingency of sale, it's a condition of sale. And the condition of sale is to have the agreed upon monies that was set forth in the contract to be adhered to as a condition of sale.
Correct.
So if the condition of sale was 3%, was to be placed in escrow within 3 business days, and only 2% was put in, that is not complying with that condition of sale.
That's right.
And so hence a notice to perform should be sent saying unless that additional 1% to equal the amount that was agreed upon, okay, needs to get put in. And if not, then the seller may cancel. And that's the key word I think agents need to understand in the notice to perform. It allows the seller to cancel. It doesn't necessarily mean that the seller has to cancel.
100%, Steve. You're 100% correct. It is defined, as Steve states, is that, the seller does have the option, right? And anything and everything that's involved in this transaction, it's mutually agreed upon between the buyer and the seller. So as Steve states, is that, yeah, even though the buyer might have accidentally thought it was only 2%, right? The seller could still say, look, it's 2%, the money is in there. I'm not going to harp over one additional percent into escrow. We can continue going forward. It's the seller's discretion if they want to press upon. But yeah, is the buyer technically in breach? Steve?
Absolutely. The buyer is in breach of the agreement at that moment up and until there is if there ends up being a new mutually agreed written position.
That's right. Yeah. All right. I'm just throwing a curveball because, again, I want you to really think about this, because that can happen. That can be a scenario, is that you are the listing agent or you're the buyer's agent in this circumstances, and what was agreed upon is not technically what's put in escrow. As one example, right? It's a give and take at the end of the day. The buyer may accidentally realize, I thought it was 2%, not a problem. Let me go ahead and put the additional $8,000 into escrow to make this a legitimate acceptance of the agreed upon contract. Okay. Yeah, but that's again, lack of communication. So if the buyer is not in the position to put the entire 3%, then the buyer shouldn't agree to the terms. Remember, this is negotiations from the very beginning, ladies and gentlemen. What I mean by that is, remember, a buyer submits an offer, and either the seller accepts or counters or rejects your offer. Those are the three options you have. You submit an offer that's clean, and the seller says, all right, I like all the terms that are in here. Let's go ahead and accept. Or the seller can say, in lieu of the acceptance, I'm going to modify this. We're going to send a seller counteroffer or a seller multiple counteroffer to multiple buyers. Now it's really different terms of what the original agreement was with the buyer. Or the seller can say, look, this offer is too low. The terms and conditions that the buyer is requesting is not to my favor. I don't want to even entertain this offer. I'd rather just cancel. And the seller has the right to do so. The seller has the right to not accept it. And you'll get what? A buyer's agent complaining and arguing and saying, well, why wasn't our offer accepted? Well, you know what? Were you in dialogue with the listing agent? Did you really hear and understand what the seller's needs and wants are, right? Because it's negotiations, right? It's the back and forth. Make it easy on yourself. Ask a lot of questions. For example, if I was the buyer's agent and Steve is the listing agent, guess what? I'm going to be asking a lot of questions because I don't want to set myself for failure. I want to set up where my buyer at least has an opportunity to get this offer accepted, right? And that's where communications and understanding what the seller's needs and wants are. Will you agree or disagree, Steve?
Absolutely. Yeah. On the big picture, the example of the deposit money is, in the sense of bringing in less than, is probably very rare. Traditionally speaking, where I think most agents run into the scenario is that money just hasn't been brought, no money has been brought into escrow yet. And it's now the fourth day or even the fifth day, business day after the opening of the escrow, and there's no money in escrow. Okay. I think on the big picture, it's rare that not, that not all the deposit money is not brought in, and you're playing a little tug of war over, will the seller allow it or not? Okay. It's more as, hey, the money, no money's been brought in. So because it's condition of sale, okay, plain and simple, here's your notice to perform because you haven't performed. And if it doesn't get in, that's it. My seller ain't going to fart around. He's, and in this case, it won't be, he may cancel, he will cancel. Okay. So absolutely. I think really we're almost where we see that notice to perform utilized most often is dealing with, of all the contingency removals, is probably the loan contingent, the lack of the loan contingency removal being removed in the time frame.
That's right. Yeah, and for the most part, as Steve was stating, yeah, that's usually when we see these dilemmas of notice to perform, usually not in the very beginning. And what happens if the buyer doesn't even put the deposit in escrow, right? You still have an active escrow. You have an escrow number, but the buyer never actually put in the deposit. What is the take there? What do you need to do? Well, you still need to send the notice to perform and have the buyer perform. Otherwise, then the seller has or shall have the right to cancel. So section 2 talks about delivery updated contact information for buyer's lender. So here's another one that a lot of agents unfortunately do not understand, that if you do not provide the lender's contact information or updated information on the lender, the seller has also the right to cancel. Well, excuse me, the right to send a notice to perform. It is part of the agreement. It's part of the process, and the seller and the listing agent should be updated with all information on the lender, okay? Because they accepted your offer based on the terms and condition, right? And part of the segue and process of this is also making sure that the lender is in alignment to make sure that we're closing on time, that we can release the loan contingency on time, that we can order the appraisal on time, and that the buyer meets all of the conditions that the buyer needs in order for them to get the funding and ultimately close this deal, right? But if we're not in any way, shape, or form getting that information, then the seller also has the right to send a notice to perform. Hey, you know what? I've been asking for the lender's information. You say you were going to provide it for me, and you haven't as of yet. Here's a notice to perform. Now, I want you to also understand that part of your responsibility is to be proactive in your engagement from the very beginning. A lot of agents on the list on the MLS will put, buyer to provide proof of funds, a pre-approval letter, and all of the contact information of who is handling or facilitating the loan as well. Why is this important? Why is this vital in your practice? Well, the reason it's vital is because you want to make sure that this buyer is golden. How many times have you been in a transaction because you didn't verify, the deal falls apart? And it happens to even seasoned, experienced agents. I got 2 agents in my office right now. One is a mega agent. The other one is a producing agent. One represented the buyer, the other represented the seller. And guess what? The deal is falling apart after a little over 30 days. Okay. Well, the lender apparently got wind of some unknown credit issues with a buyer. Something doesn't sound right, but ultimately that's the avenue that they're using to back out. Now, the good thing is the buyer did not release the loan contingency. So if they have the evidence and the proof that they cannot qualify, then the buyer has the right to exercise that right to back out of the deal and ultimately just pay whatever escrow fees, but the entire deposit goes back to the buyer. So who is right and who is wrong really depends. The listing agent was giving the agent the benefit of the doubt because they work in the same company, the same office. But ultimately, this went sideways and now the deal is collapsing. Okay. And that can happen. This is why you need to be on the listing agent, on the buyer's agent, but more so on the lender. Okay. If you have a solid lender that you work with, then do a cross qualify, right? Let's just say, for example, Chris Rivera as your lender, your go-to. Hey, Chris, just I want to let you know I picked up a listing here in the city of Torrance. I'm going to be putting on the MLS. Would it be okay that you can do a cross qualify, on any offers that come in? So that way we're not wasting any time. You're the expert in that field. I'm the expert in selling the home, but can you be my second eyes on this to make sure that, they will be able to qualify, and more so, do you see anything that maybe I don't see? That's what we call cross qualify. Okay. And then when an offer comes in, let's say that it comes from Salvador, I'm going to say, Salvador, thank you very much for your offer. As part of the stipulation is, your client needs to be cross-qualified. Not saying that, they need to go with our lender, but they just need to be verified that they're good to go. And, in speaking with you and speaking with your lender, it seems okay, but I just want to make sure that we are protecting my client's best interests. Yes, sir.
When they do that, they do a soft check credit? Or...
They typically don't. They'll look at all of the current stuff that they have. They'll request all the documentation from the current lender. But if there's something that just doesn't seem, then they may request, the buyer to do a credit pull. But typically that's not the case. If they feel that there's something just not aligning, they may ask for it, but the buyer can also refuse and says no. But then that gives us an indicator, obviously what we call the pulse, that, hey, something is probably not right on this. Maybe you should reconsider in accepting this offer, right? The little things can become a big thing. So this is why you want to cover all parameters on your position. Okay. Good question, by the way. All right, so let's continue. So funds, where did I leave off? So number 2, deliver, and then paragraph 5C3, deliver a notice if it's an FHA or VA cost of terms, if any is specified, and then CAR form RR, which is your request of repairs. And number 4, delivery verification or satisfactory verification if seller's reasonable disapproves of the verification already provided as required by paragraph 5B or 6A. And delivery a letter as required by paragraph 6B, and in writing assume or accept lease specified in paragraph 8G, and then return statutory and other disclosures as required by paragraph 11F, and then cooperating with the title company efforts to comply with the GTO as required by paragraph 13E, and then sign or initial a separate liquidated damage form for any increased deposit as required by paragraph 5A2 and 2029, and then provide evidence of authority to sign in a representative capacity as specified in paragraph 28, and perform any additional buyer contractual obligations, including in this agreement. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit, except for any fees incurred by buyer and other expenses already paid by escrow. Shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit, except for the fees, right? And escrow pursuant to this agreement prior to seller's cancellation. All right, so there's a lot of information on here, right? And there's a lot of things that have to happen in order to affect the cancellation. As I stated earlier, a seller cannot just say, I'm going to cancel on you, which I've seen where the seller just decides to cancel. No good reason. They just decide to cancel. Well, who's in breach of the contract? The seller is. Yeah. The seller in this case would be in breach of the contract. And therefore, the buyer has every right for pursuing this, because the seller has breach. But let's just say that the buyer doesn't perform, right? And I go back to what Steve was saying earlier regarding the position of loan contingency, right? Because that's usually the last layer of protection that the buyer has before exposing their deposit. All right. It's usually when the buyer releases the loan contingency or any and all contingency, which reflects to the loan. Now, most buyer agents want to hold on to that loan contingency as tight as possible. And you should be cautious as well as a buyer's agent. And why do you think you need to caution yourself, even though you know that the 17-day is upon us? Why would I say caution you in the position that, you want to protect the buyers? Any reason for that? I gave you the answer earlier.
If you have that responsibility to your client as a buyer, protect their deposit.
That's right. You have a fiduciary responsibility to take care of your client's best interest, right? And if you're representing the buyer in this case, you want to protect them, right? Especially if there's a huge deposit, right? A huge deposit. If they're asking up to 3% of the deposit, that can be a substantial, that's almost like a down payment, for crying out loud. Yeah. That's right. Now you got to play the game, right? I just was dealing with one of the agents, and they submitted an offer, and they got their offer accepted, but they only put $5,000 on a $600,000 price point. Okay, and they got the offer accepted. So their risk is not as big, right, as they would have if they would have put, $15,000 or $10,000, right? So you got to kind of know where you stand and ultimately know where you can kind of jab a little bit, right? In this case, a $5,000 deposit may be a lot for some, but maybe not so much for others. But you look at it from a risk factor. If this goes belly up, the transaction goes sideways, you expose yourself. What happens? And mostly it's like investors that go in there because they're going to do work. They're going to renovate the property. They want to get their offer accepted, right? They want to get their foot inside their offer in escrow, right? So they're willing to release certain conditions in order for them to be more enticing, more appealing to the seller, right? And this is what exactly transpired. It's a fixer-upper. They went with the motion of buying this property with the intent to renovate it and ultimately sell it for a profit. So they threw in a low deposit and they got their offer accepted. So again, it's not always the misconception that the offer always has to be up to 3% of the deposit, right? Get a feel for it. If it's not a avenue of conversation, you tell your buyers, what are you feel comfortable putting as a deposit? And I'm very clear on that, right? Where I set the expectations from the very beginning, because the first thing that the buyer is am I going to lose my deposit if I don't go through with the process, right? Or the escrow. And especially when you're dealing with first-time home buyers, right? They're already scared as it is. And it's our job to ensure them everything's going to be fine. But the question we get a lot is, am I going to lose my deposit? Well, no, it really depends. There's certain things that must happen in order for you to ultimately jeopardize or put your deposit in risk.
Simon, can I chime in real quick?
Absolutely, Steve.
Okay. This notice to perform is really actually a very hot topic that agents need to absolutely inform their clients of very early in the escrow process. Okay. And matter of fact, which all go, it all first and foremost boils down to the words communication, you know, and informative communication of what each other, which of the, each party's expectations are of each other. And so when you're having the dialogue with, when you are a listing agent, as an example, you are having the dialogue with your seller about what the expectations are of the buyers and what the contingencies mean and the time frames of what they mean. And same thing when you are the buyer's agent, when you are now writing the offer and or negotiating, and then once the offer is accepted, it is very important to communicate to your buyer the importance that these dates and days have significance. Okay, it's just not numbers on a piece of paper. It has time frames. These are time frames of performance. Performance meaning that they, as the buyer, need to be able to sign off these respective contingencies. Now, why the loan one is so important and why buyers have the most angst with it is because their money is tied up on the basis of so many other hands being involved on whether or not they get approval. There's first an appraisal that has to take place as part of the loan process. Then there's the loan underwriter. I mean, to start off first with the loan, the loan originator, the mortgage guy. And so there's so many hands, but you have to inform them that whenever then there is a request from your lender, everything needs to be timely met on getting the information back to the lender in a timely way, because every day in which it is not done timely, you are stealing that time on the back end. Because if at that time frame, when that contingency time frame comes, typically the default of 17 days of the contract, the seller can and very well may require you to sign off on that loan contingency when you don't have final loan contingency. Okay. And that is a big risk on your part. Understand, because you're going to have to make a choice if it comes down to it. Either you take the risk or you back out of the sale. Okay. And so it's one of which then, when you are a listing agent, though, one of the recommendations I always recommend when I'm a listing agent is when the day comes of the time frame expiration and a contingency has not been signed off, I recommend that a notice to perform be issued, but we hold off on the actual cancellation based on the communication that the other party gives. It should be just another 2 or 3 more days to be able to get the final contingent, loan approval. All right, we will give you that, but we're going to end up allowing us to be in position that if that doesn't occur, that the seller can now be able to have the right to do it. And so communication really becomes the biggest part of that equation.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. So just to add to what Steve was saying, remember, it's not just set in stone, right? Now, again, going back that the contract defines and gives you all the answers, and it also says that the buyer has to release certain contingencies, and if they don't, then the notice to perform. But one other layer that the buyer has as an advantage is communications, as Steve said. There's a form that allows the buyer, if they need the extra time to release a contingency, then it's again an opportunity for the buyers and the buyer agent and the listing agent and the seller to come to some type of agreement. That form is called the extension of time addendum. which if the buyer needs time, they're on vacation, they haven't got the answer, the appraisal was delayed in the 17-day or the 10-day or the 12-day is coming close, it's your job to be proactive and have the conversation with the agent. Steve, hey, this is Simon over at KW. Listen, I just got notification that our appraisal is not going to be here till next week. And I know we have to release appraisal contingency on Thursday. I'm giving you notice that we're requesting an extension of time to release that condition. Okay. Steve is going to, have that conversation with the seller and say, look, well, how much time do you think you're going to need? Right. Again, it's communication. Now, does the seller have to give us the extension? The answer is no. The seller does not, because we already originally agreed to a 10-day, a 15-day, or a 17-day, right? We're asking for a modification because things happen through the initial process of escrow, folks, okay? From one day to the other, something may change. This is why it's not always set in stone. Does that make sense? Right? This is why you need to collaborate, communicate, and be on the same page with the agent. Because if I have a great rapport with Steve, Steve is going to vouch for me, right? And says, look, Simon, you've been a stand-up guy. You've been, been very diligent, professional. And, I'm going to let the seller know, and I should get an answer by this afternoon or this evening.
Well, right? And even more important than that is that your client, whether it be seller or buyer, takes the lead from you as the agent. Okay. And so if you have excellent communication and you have no good faith reason to believe otherwise, okay, your endorsement of allowing the additional time to take place should almost be a slam dunk, because your client looks to you as their advisor.
100%. Yep, 100%. Does that all make kind of sense? Remember, everything is a give and take, right? But if you're in dialogue and communications with the agent, it should allow the streamlined process to be a lot smoother than when you have lack of communication or no communication at all.
Oh, completely. Right? If all of a sudden now we're in transaction, but Simon, you're the buyer's agent, I'm the listing agent, and I haven't heard squat from you until day 17. Oh, and now it's day 17. Oh, we need an extension. And it's like, whoa. And it's like, you have no value in my book because there's been zero communication from you. Okay. Yeah. As to really, is it really real what you're telling me, or is this just 100% manufactured? And so, and that's why communication is so key, with the other agents, and it really makes the difference.
Oh yeah, 100%. That makes a difference. And again, you can see it from two different perspectives on it here. Is I'd rather be, in the forefront of that conversation. Remember, there's three elements to conversation: is the good, the bad, and the ugly. We all love to give good news, right? We don't necessarily like to give bad news, but we definitely do not like giving horrible news, right? The deal is going to fall apart. It looks like it's going to cancel. But it's your job. It's your duty. This is why you get paid the big bucks. It's to be able to have these conversations and know how to maneuver those, right? Again, sometimes it's out of your hands, out of your control. But if you're not at least in dialogue and conversing this with the opposing agent, how much credibility are you going to get from that agent? Just like Steve stated, right? He's not going to say, well, you just telling me about this. Why should I give your clients that extension, right? What else are you not telling me that I should be aware of, right? But if I start, 3-4 days prior, says, hey, Steve, you know what? I know that we're releasing that contingency and it's coming close. I just want to be proactive in my engagement with you. And it's always been a great communications with you. I think we have some delays on this, and I'm not going to be able to release that as a condition. that gives us an opportunity to try to iron out, because he's going to ask questions. I'm going to have to, respond to those questions as well, because no one is just going to say, yeah, I'll give you the extension. There has to be a reason for that extension.
Yeah, I'm going to be asking, well, what exactly is the challenge that the buyer is experiencing? What is it? And now maybe, okay, we can put our heads together and collaborate together, because right. which I have done, okay, because the goal is to get the sale closed, okay, and sometimes, believe it or not, the solution can come from the other agent, okay, right. And but so by being proactive of letting the other agent know that there are some challenges that are there, okay, and you let them know kind of on the front end for the most part, and sometimes collaboration works in your favor.
That's right. Well, and remember, I don't think that either agent wants to cancel escrow, right? You work so hard, the buyer finding, identifying, negotiating, showing, getting the offer accepted, right? So there's a lot of work that a buyer's agent does just to get this property in escrow. And it's no difference than the seller's agent, right? They had the time, effort, and ultimately accepted your offer, but there was negotiations on their part too. No one at the end wants to start over, because there's no guarantee that they're going to get the same terms and condition. So it doesn't really benefit the buyer's agent or the seller's agent, because our number one goal is to close the deal. And if we can find the avenue of solution, think outside the box, and ultimately navigate a win-win for both parties, then we continue, but it's the last attempt, right, where it just doesn't look like, this deal is going to go through. It's like the Titanic, it's going down. Then unfortunately that needs to happen, and it will happen, right? But if there's an avenue to work and communicate and dialogue and work as a team, I'm going to ask, Steve for his permission to continue this, but we need more time. But it's my job to really have that conversation with Steve, right? And explain, look, we just need a few more days to release this. And then once we do, there's other avenues, but I do not really recommend that you go, but there is other avenues that you can explore this. Remember, because the seller doesn't have to give us an extension of time, right? So the buyer may say, look, in lieu of giving us that extension to release loan contingency, the buyer may want to release a small percentage or a portion of the buyer's deposit immediately to the seller in good faith. Because that money is still, it's going to go to the seller regardless, right? But you want that extra time, right? That may be another negotiating perspective where we're willing to release, a couple $1,000s in good faith for an additional 2 to 3 days to release that condition. The buyer is, bending a little bit to make this work, and the seller ultimately can bend as well. Does the seller is required to do so? No. The seller may say, look, you know what? I got a strong offer as a backup right now. They're solid. They've seen all the inspections. They're ready to go. Unfortunately, your offer got accepted before theirs, but we're going to go on a different trajectory on this. And the seller has the right. Even if the buyer releases all the deposit, the seller can say, nope, I'm going to cancel, and I'm going to open it escrow with another buyer.
And always remember, when you're a buyer's agent right now, if you're still on the newer side, before you negotiate releasing deposits to the seller, make sure you review that with your broker first before doing that unilaterally. Okay, get your broker's blessing before you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Any time when there's release of any type of monetary to the opposing, you want to at least have a conversation with the broker, just so that we're all on the same page. Because what happens most often is that the buyer says, well, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what I was signing. I don't know what the agent was telling me. And what are you saying that I'm not getting my deposit back? What are you saying that I lost 10% on my $20,000 deposit? I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and you're having the dialogue. So you have extra layer of conversation that you at least spoke with the broker. Does that make sense? Okay. Don't just go out there and do chaos, you know, make sure your broker is aware as well. So thank you, Steve, for sharing that as well. Right. Okay. So final is section C3, seller right to cancel, seller's contingency. I think that's more seller may cancel this agreement by good faith exercise of any seller contingency, including this agreement, otherwise agreed, so long as the contingency has not already been removed or waived in writing. So that basically stipulates that if the seller has a contingency in place, meaning that let's say that the seller has a contingency of the purchasing a replacement property, right, or identifying a property, then they have to release that as part of their condition in order for us to continue moving forward. And if the seller does not with the time specified, then the the buyer has the right to send a notice to perform, and now the buyer has the right to cancel on the seller because the seller now breached the contract. Okay, so it's a two-way street. If the property if escrow is a 30-day escrow, right, and on the 30th day the buyer does not close, then instead of the notice to perform, you're going to send out the DCE form, the demand to close escrow. That allows the buyer 72 hours to perform, and if the buyer does not perform, then the seller shall have the right to cancel. And by that time, I'm assuming that the buyer has released all contingencies. The seller may be able to go up to 3% of the deposit in escrow. Okay. Thoughts, questions, concerns regarding cancellations, right to cancel? Does all this make sense? Yeah. Okay. I hope this kind of prepares you to understand the elements of, if you're representing a seller in this case, right? Not necessarily a buyer, which you should know as a buyer, but this is more a position from a seller's point. You're the listing agent and everything's all about timing, right? And do not drag your feet when it comes to these conditions, because it's going to impact you in the long run. Someone is going to be upset and they're going to start pointing fingers, and they're going to be pointing fingers at you. So have that clear, concise understanding. If they agree to a 30-day escrow, they agree to 17 days to release contingencies, that you hold them accountable to that. Okay. If they need that extra time, then they need to put it in an extension of time, but they need to be in communications, right? And if the seller does not give that extension or does not perform, well, the seller then has the right to cancel and move on, right? But it has to be mutually agreed of the cancellation, because the buyer may not want to cancel. But you cannot hold the property hostage for a long time if the buyer is the one that breached the contract. Because I've seen this firsthand, is they wait 17 days, the notice to perform, they give them the 48 hours, they still don't release that condition. And now on the 72nd day, now they release that as a condition. Well, it's already too late. If the seller says, look, I gave you the time necessary, you didn't perform, we cancel, we sent you the CC form, the cancellation of contract, therefore the seller has the right. And you want to have paper trail just in case this comes back to bite you. Now, everything is circumstances, right? Because the buyer may have a compelling reason for that delay. And if they have a very good compelling position, they might be able to turn it over. Nothing is set in stone. I hate to say it. Nothing is always black and white, but when you have more to the agreement, your position is stronger, if that makes sense. So, all right, with that being said, that's pretty much all I have. Any final thoughts, questions before we close out today's session?
Nope.
All right. Well, I appreciate you all. Thank you very much. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to call me, text me, or email me, and I'll be more than happy to to answer your question. Again, Steve, like always, thank you very much for your due diligence and
My pleasure.
proactive and always being my role-playing partner on this.
Very good. And also remind them about my contract Q&A Wednesday nights from 7 to 8 at that point. So it should be on KW Shares.
Beautiful, beautiful. Awesome, Steve.
Thank you, Simon.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a
Bye.
wonderful. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.